Hi, Bio. All right, so today is your last video lesson, and I am equally as excited about you because really teaching to a camera these last 2 months has not been my thing. I mean, I don't mind it, but not the same as being in the classroom with you guys and asking you questions and you guys making me laugh. You guys have kept me on my toes this year, especially you ladies. 3 of you together are dangerous. But anyway, so a couple little housekeeping things before we wrap up this module. Just as a reminder, because I didn't remind you in the last 2 videos, you still need to do your vocab if you haven't already. There is the vocab words for this module on Quizlet in the classroom, and you need to complete the test section if you want credit for the vocabulary words for the quiz, which is 20% of your grade this quarter of the quizzes. So make sure you've done that if you haven't already. All right, and so let's wrap up this final little bit of material, and then I will tell you at the end how we're closing out the year. So, right here we're looking at a picture of the bony fish again. We didn't finish our discussion of the bony fish in the last module, or what we would think of as a typical fish. And so in this image, although the main blood vessels are highlighted because we're about to talk about the circulatory system, these are not the only blood vessels that the fish has. There's much more. These are just kind of the main ones so that you can get an overview and as point of reference and perhaps just for review. The red represents blood that has oxygen in it and is carrying oxygen throughout the body, while the blue represents the deoxygenated blood, or the blood that does not have oxygen in it, instead has carbon dioxide waste that is headed back to the heart, essentially, or in this case, as we're going to see, some different features. So, first things first, the circulatory system begins with blood that flows from a 2-chambered heart. Okay, we as humans have a 4-chamber heart, and various other organisms may have a 3 or 2 or other size hearts, but we are 4. The fish is 2. One is the atrium, which is the heart chamber that receives blood, and then the ventricle is the other, which is the heart chamber from which blood is pumped. And it is similar in humans. We just have 2 atria and 2 ventricles. Blood leaves the heart through large blood vessels called the ventral aorta, and the aorta branches into many smaller vessels called afferent brachial arteries, which supply blood to the capillaries to the gills where this is all occurring. And blood will leave the gills through the efferent brachial arteries and dump blood into what's called the dorsal aorta. And some of this blood goes to the brain, and others to cells in the head of the fish. Once blood is oxygen poor, that is, once it has delivered its oxygen and now does not have very much oxygen, it is carried back to the heart in the anterior cardiac vein. Okay, so it actually shares, if you study human blood circulation, it shares many similar features and similar blood vessels. It's just not quite as complex as human blood circulation is. All right. Okay, and so the blood that travels throughout the body, that is the blood that's not going to the brain and the head, as we just said, will pass through a kidney. And we have 2 kidneys, which serve a similar function, which is to filter out waste material. And so once the blood has done its job, that should say, I believe, once the kidney has done its job. That's a typo mistake on my part. Once the kidney has done its job, the posterior cardiac vein will carry that blood that got filtered of the waste from the kidney back to the heart, and then the process will begin again. So essentially, both in bony fish and in humans, the kidney is a giant blood filter, filtering out waste that we don't need, and the waste ends up leaving our bodies through urine, and things that the body needs to retain or recycle will go back to the heart for more circulation. Fish are considered ectothermic organisms, so they lack the internal mechanism for regulating body heat. And so fish are cold-blooded, and they're very sensitive to the temperature of water for which they are swimming in. And so their body temperature fluctuates with the water temperature. Okay. And so this next slide is just some members from this class. Okay, some of these may be more familiar to you, some not. If we had been in the classroom, I had a couple videos that went over just some unique fish out there. If you're feeling so compelled, you can check out the short video that I have posted below here that just goes over like the world's top 10 most unique fish. I found it pretty cool. There were some things about fish I did not know. It's a short video, so that's linked below if you feel so compelled as to dive a little deeper into some of the fish that exist out there. But we will not be diving quite as deep into these fish as we would have had been in the classroom. We were slated to dissect a bony fish and to see some of these internal organs ourselves, but unfortunately that's just not how the cookie crumbled this year. All right, so let's jump into a couple fact checks before turning to our last class of organisms that we are going to study. Number 1, a student sees a portion of a rib from a fish and notices that it is made of cartilage. Based on this, the student says it cannot believe it. That shouldn't say believe. Oh my gosh, it cannot belong to class Osteochitsu. You know what I'm getting at. Is the student correct? Why? So the student is wrong. It can belong to this particular class because bony fish have some cartilaginous parts, although most of their bones are calcified or hardened. But there are a few places, including the ribs, that are more cartilaginous than they are calcified. So it can, in fact, still belong to this class. Number 2. A fish expels a lot of digestible fat from its anus. What organ is probably not functioning properly? That would be the gallbladder and liver. So the liver is not functioning properly because it's not producing enough bile to help with that fat digestion. And so that is typically what happens to someone who doesn't have a gallbladder, to release the bile into the intestines. And number 3. Most arteries carry oxygen-rich blood, as the blood is traveling away from the heart in order to supply oxygen to the surrounding tissues. Name an artery in the fish that carries oxygen-poor blood. So either the ventral aorta or the afferent brachial arteries would both be acceptable answers, and lucky for you, you don't have to memorize those pictures because I don't really have a way to test you on them. Had we been in class, you would have had to know some of those major arteries, but lucky you, we're keeping it simple. And finally, the last class we're going to talk about is class Amphibia, which, as you guys know, contains amphibians. So most of amphibians begin their life cycle in the water in the larval stage, and they breathe through gills in the water. The young amphibians will hatch from eggs that are allowed to develop outside of the mother, so this is external. And during metamorphosis, though, the gills begin to degenerate and an air-breathing respiratory system develops. And so at this point, the fins also begin to disappear, and they begin to develop legs. Adult female amphibians lay eggs which are externally fertilized by the male in the water, and then this process begins all over again. So this is how we go from, say, a tadpole to a frog, something that's swimming in the water, to something that's capable of hopping on land. This process right here. All right, I have a little joke for you guys because it wouldn't be the last video if I didn't do something really corny and embarrassing. So here's my joke. What job does a frog have at a hotel? The bellhop. Just kidding. Okay, I'm done, I swear. Okay, so the larvae of an amphibian are often called the tadpole, as I just said, and amphibians have several distinguishing characteristics which separate it from the rest of subphylum Vertebrata. And so these are the distinguishing characteristics. For one, they have an endoskeleton made mostly of bone. They have a smooth skin with many capillaries and pigments, so they have no scales, unlike some of the other creatures that we've just studied, like the sharks and the bony fish. They have 2 pairs of limbs with webbed feet, or most amphibians have webbed feet. As they have as many as 4 organs for respiration. They have a 3-chambered heart. So the fish that we just studied, the bony fish, only had a 2. We have a 4. They have a 3. and they are oviparous with external fertilization. So if you were asked on a test to list the distinguishing characteristics of amphibians, this would be your list. Hint, hint. All right, talking more specifically and more in depth about the circulation and the respiration of amphibians. So all amphibians, as we said, have gills during that larval stage when they first begin life, but as the gills degenerate, they're replaced by lungs. And the gills are basically generally only used for backup. The main organ that amphibians use for respiration is their skin. So this is kind of like the earthworm, where we learned that it mostly uses the cuticle and the skin, or the epidermis, to breathe. So similar idea here, because the skin is very rich in capillaries in an amphibian. It uses the lining of its mouth for respiration as well and for gas exchange. And so it has many means of respiration, which makes it comfortable both in and out of the water. So that's why you can see frogs going from both environments, because they have so many means to carry out respiration. So they can go a long time without filling their lungs, which allows them to stay submerged in the water despite being predominantly land-dwelling organisms. All right, and so amphibians are ectotherms, and so their temperature of surroundings affects them greatly. Again, they have no internal mechanism for maintaining their body temperature like we do as humans. We are endotherms. And so when the temps drop, such as in the winter, they will burrow into the mud, and the cooling of the mud lowers the temperature of their internal organs. And as this happens, this cooling down slows down the chemical reactions going on inside their body, and it puts the amphibian in a deep state of hibernation. Hibernation, as you guys know, is a state of extremely low metabolism and respiration, accompanied by lower than normal body temperatures, much like bears hibernate and some other organisms hibernate. And so the slowing of these chemical processes means that the amphibian doesn't really need to eat, because it doesn't need to derive nutrients from its food to carry out these chemical processes, because they're occurring so slowly. And so as temps rise, the chemical processes begin to speed up and work again, and the amphibian can resume its normal life. But this is a reality of being an ectotherm as an amphibian. So the circulatory system of an amphibian is very similar to the circulatory system that we just discussed in the bony fish, but there are a few key differences which we're going to highlight. So the first is that it's composed of 3 chambers instead of 2. So the heart is composed of 3 chambers instead of 2, a single ventricle, and a left and a right atria. We as humans, as I said, have a left and a right atria and a left and a right ventricle, so we have 4. The left atrium gets filled with oxygen-rich blood that comes from the lungs, mouth, or skin, so one of the many means of respiration for the amphibians. It is then dumped into the left atrium by the large pulmonary vein. From there, 3 large veins fill the sinus venous with oxygen-poor blood, and the sinus venous then empties that oxygen-poor blood into the right atrium. Once the atrium is filled, both atria then dump their contents into the one single ventricle. This mixes the oxygen-rich blood with the oxygen-poor blood, so the blood that has a lot of oxygen and the blood that does not have a lot of oxygen. This mixture then gets pumped out one single artery that's called the conus arteriosus, which then splits into 2 smaller arteries called the left and the right truncus arteriosus. All right, so I know that's kind of a lot. I'm not expecting you to follow it entirely, but that's the detail that we're given from here. And so this is actually, it's rather unique because most organisms don't mix their oxygen rich with their oxygen poor blood. So this is unique to certain organisms like the amphibians. In humans, we have arteries and veins, and the arteries carry the oxygen rich and the veins carry the oxygen poor, and they don't exactly mix. They have to travel through the circulatory system again to become oxygen rich. But we don't mix both like the amphibian does. All right, and so each truncus arteriosus splits into 3 smaller arteries, 2 of which are the carotid arches, which send blood to the head of the amphibian, and there's 1 for each truncus arteriosus, and then also to a aortic arch, which fuses into a single dorsal aorta, and finally the pulmocutaneous arteries, which take blood to the lungs, skin, and mouth. Right? So these 3 smaller arteries branch off of the truncus arteriosus. And here's an image just showing you the 3-chambered heart of the amphibian, as well as you can see these arteries here, the ventricle, the atrium, okay, and the different aortic branches and arches all off here. So again, lucky you, you get out of having to label that on a real test this year. All right, and so here's some members of class Amphibia: salamander, the frog, and the toad. We're going to end with a fact check, and then I will let you know how we're ending the school year, wrapping up the school year. So, number 1, an amphibian is breathing with gills. Is it in the larval stage or the adult stage? It would be breathing in the larval stage through gills, because that's the only time that we find the gills active. And number 2, a frog that has overexerted itself leaves its mouth open wide. Why? Why would it do that? Because remember, the frog can breathe through the lining of its mouth. It can participate in gas exchange through its mouth. Okay? And so with that, that is the end of Module 13. We kind of blew through it because this was the last week, but I know you guys can handle all this fun, exciting information. So with that, you have one final class marker test to complete. I will send out the link today, immediately following this video release. So be on the lookout in your emails. This link is only available until June 4th, okay? Because we are wrapping up. Today's the last day for video lessons. You have about 2 weeks now to get me any work that you have not done so far. So anything not received, including this test, by June 5th, is a 0 with no exceptions. That is Mrs. Spain's policy, and we are sticking to it. So that is the end of the quarter. So what you need to do is you need to go back into ClassReach at this time, okay, and you need to look to see if you do not have a grade for an assignment. It means I never received the assignment, and that could be because issues with technology, or it could be that you forgot to send it to me or something. Either way, if you do not have a grade in ClassReach, work on getting that to me. Even if you have to resend it, forward the original email, whatever, you will not be penalized as long as I have everything before the 5th of June, which is a Friday. All right, and so with that, you guys know how the class marker test works when I get the link. If you have any questions, email me, and I will probably talk to you several times between now and the official end of school, but I hope you guys have a great summer if I don't get a chance to do so.